colleagues, thank you all for your coming, and I think we can start. And we have 10 minutes for presentation and question. So we can start with group number 1.
Dmitry, group number 1. Okay, so our presentation hasn't changed much in terms of its content, but it now has some slides, so I hope it's going to, it's going to help us illustrate our point. And also, we tried to answer some of the questions that were asked, which were very interesting and productive. First thing, again, to reiterate why we think it's good to have a common language. Consider this macro level cognitive dissonance between the faculty member who operates in terms of values, cultural capital, intellectual capital, intellectual tradition, or uses terms like negative capabilities without clear definition for someone who is like a program designer who designs a curriculum and wants to find out which courses to include and how to modify the courses. So the program designer thinks in terms of the competences which he or she takes from, let's say, a job market or a state regulation or from some kind of theory of education that is competency-based theory of education. And faculty speak in terms of cultural capital, right? They don't have a common language to talk to each other, and they can only hate each other. So administration usually thinks that faculty is lazy, and the only thing they do is just to obscure everything so that they can do whatever they like, which means do nothing. I mean, not to change the curriculum, not to change the classes, that's to work the way I used to working, which is most convenient to them, which is not necessarily most beneficial for the students. And for faculty, administration is viewed as these guys who just dictated by some kind of external non-university, non-intellectual concerns, like you have to, fill the requirements of the state, or dictated by some very utilitarian, primitive ideas of education. So there is no dialogue, and it's a source of conflicts. Whereas if both of these parties were kind of formulating what they want from education in terms of competences, then it's very well possible to really find a compromise, or really find that sometimes there is not much a contradiction between one and the other, and something that is required to really read complex text is also maybe required for somebody from a job market, not necessarily complex, but some analytical reasoning is useful there and there. So sometimes it is used, right? I think the concept of critical thinking is precisely this attempt to bridge the gap, but it doesn't work very well, as we found out last year. So maybe it's good to really go to the full-blown competency model. Now, this is what we suggest what happens, because the strong objection to competency model is that it's very complex. Either it primitivizes the education too much, or if it doesn't, it's so complex that it makes no sense to really use it because it takes too much time to really process. And the answer is that you don't necessarily have to, if you have a teaching module, you don't have to break it down for competences or to a system of competences, because there are different level competences, etc. You don't have to do that. What you do if you reproduce a module, you just reproduce a model, like how we organized core curriculum here. We just took some courses we were familiar with at places like Columbia, and we just reproduced them with some changes, right? And here we go. And there are a number of competences in these courses. We didn't have to list them or structure them. We just reproduced the tradition of teaching this particular course. But then what happens is that if you're attentive, you see that something doesn't work, in the course, and that, for example, you think that, well, students are supposed to be able to do something, and they don't after they've taken this course. For example, they struggle with some kind of complex analysis, some philosophical ideas, which is apparently should be the outcome of this course, one of the outcomes of this course. And what you do, when you see something dysfunctional, you have to take this dysfunctional layer and decompose it into the competences. And then you think, well, this particular thing doesn't work, so maybe we should just give some additional assignments, modify it somehow so that works, and transform dysfunctional layer to the functional layer. What's important to realize is that it doesn't require decomposing the whole course into competences, which might not be possible. What's required is decompose something you want to change, because our argument is that you cannot change anything without this decomposition. How we can save beyond component, which was articulated by group 2 if you have this approach. So we have this analogy of complex Hermitian matrix. And complex Hermitian matrix is a complex matrix. So numbers here, which are zeros here, is actually complex numbers. So they have real component and imaginary component. And they are used to describe quantum objects. Quantum objects are complex matrices. But they are Hermitian complex matrices, and that means that eigenvalue, as defined at собственное значение, eigenvalue of this matrix is always real. That is to say, the object that you describe is described from complex matrices with numbers that don't exist in the real world. But whenever you want to calculate some kind of result, like a measurement that you can take with some kind of equipment, it's actually a real number. It doesn't have it doesn't have an imaginary component, and that's the real number. So I think something similar can be performed in terms of education. So you have some complex, in a sense that not real, but complex, right? Philosophy, like aesthetic philosophy, negative compatibility, whatever you call it, which you argue cannot be rationally decomposed in all these many, elements. Okay, and you have a course which apparently is good for negative capability development, right? I mean, somehow Gradebooks course, for example, works this way. And then when somebody who has this course based on the understanding of negative capability, which cannot be rendered in terms of real numbers, in terms of competences, still sees something dysfunctional, what happens is that it takes the eigenvalue, so to speak, of this aesthetic philosophy, whatever negative capability, which is translatable into the competency model. You say, well, yeah, the person should have this particular understanding of the world, which is not rational, therefore it's difficult to rationally describe. But in order to do that, that person has to be able to, compare one statement and another statement from two philosophy books, and that's what students don't do. This is a kind of clear competency that it lacks. So you change that, you change something, and you change the educational module, right? The educational module is changed. It still has this unfathomable core, which you cannot really rationally decompose, but you use the rational thinking in order to change it to make it better. Also for fulfilling the purposes of negative capability, whatever it might be. And finally, it was a question, what is not a competency, right? I think Matvey asked it, right? Now, in our understanding, what is not a competency, but still has place in the university education, is educational instrument. That's it. So either it's a competency or educational instrument. For example, life experience, like emotional shock, right? You send students to the forest in winter, something happens with them there, they have some kind of experience which is difficult it's not a competency, but it only has place in university if it actually works to develop something. For example, to get them a more kind of a deeper knowledge of extreme conditions that human can survive. Or it gives them, as Dmitry gave an example when he was in a business school, they sent him for 2 weeks in South Africa in the mines, right? That was a very different culture. Why it was a useful educational experience? Because it actually made the kind of abstract knowledge about cultural difference a kind of more felt knowledge of cultural difference. Therefore, the capacity to do something, the competencies that require this knowledge, like competency to, for example, communicate with people from different culture, got better developed in him, because he not only knew that people are different, he kind of knew it by heart that people are different. Therefore, his abilities and skills also developed in terms of how you work with that. That's it, right? So this is our very primitive flattening, but I think the only one possible view of education.
Thank you, group number 1. Any questions or comments? Nothing? Everything clear?
Sorry, I was busy editing a picture of Andrei. So could you flip to the first slide, please?
This one?
Yes. When I was listening to this, I was wondering, why do you think program designers are the only people responsible for designing the program? Why can't faculty help them, sit with them in the same room and say, okay, here you're doing the wrong thing. Negative capability should be introduced, so let's do this and that. And a similar question, at least in the similar direction, why can't program designers be expert in the necessary principles and frameworks of education, such as negative capability and etc. Why do you see them as those technical android-like beings who just construct programs out of predetermined competency pieces? Why can't they be, theoretically grounded?
Yeah, they're just examples. You can reverse them. You can say, well, there is a faculty who thinks in terms of competences, and there is a very smart program designer who actually thinks in terms of negative capability. What we try to illustrate that is that there are positions, and in order to have dialogue between this position, they should speak a common language. That's it. I mean, who speaks which language is I think, depends on the context.
Yeah, but why can't that common language be one that also has the beyond part? Why does it only have to be competencies?
Because look at our slide number 2. The only way to change the curriculum is to actually use competence language. You cannot change the curriculum if you don't decompose at least a part of your negative capability into competences, like here, right? If you remain on the level of philosophical abstractions, however valuable and interesting they might be, you cannot make any practical conclusion about how to change the particular educational module. If you want to make curriculum, if you want to do curricular development, you have to start speaking competence language. And it doesn't mean that you should speak only this language. You can continue speaking philosophical language, but in the part of curriculum development, you have to speak competency language, and that's where you can have dialogue with somebody who doesn't believe in negative capability.
Not so long ago, universities weren't divided into faculty and program managers, and faculty were generally responsible for administrative matters and for the idea behind the university. And I wonder, within your language of competencies, it's possible to change things within the paradigm of the university that you're using, but is it possible within a framework defined in terms of competencies to reimagine the entire paradigm?
The entire paradigm that involves different roles for faculty and program designers, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, that's the paradigm within which you're working. Is it possible to reimagine the whole paradigm of the university and when you're just dealing with competencies that optimize the current model?
Well, I think what is required to change the paradigm is to find place for philosophers, right, in the curriculum design. And right now, I think the problem with philosophers placed in the curriculum design is that they and program managers, so to speak different languages, and they just misunderstand each other. And the way to do that is for philosophers, so to speak, to realize that, well, whatever complex philosophical ideas they may have about education, they have to translate their suggestions about what to do in the classroom in competence language, right? Right now, because they can, or maybe some of them do, right? But many of them do resist doing that. The result is that they are not part of the picture at all. So since something has to be done with the curriculum tomorrow, and philosophers just tell us something that we don't know how to deal with, then they're just left out of the conversation. The program is designed by stupid bureaucrats who just put the competences and kind of simple instruments, and philosophers then just kind of complain that it's too primitive, etc. So I think this is a way to actually introduce more philosophy in the curriculum development.
So was that a yes or a no?
Well, it depends on how you understand the whole change in the whole paradigm.
I mean, imagining something completely different that can't be accounted for within the current set of competencies that you're teaching.
Well, in this framework, I don't think it's possible to just imagine something radically new. I think there are limits, right, to this language, because something radically new, something that this language cannot define would be to do something with students which doesn't have educational outcomes. And maybe we can imagine a university which doesn't deal with changing their students in a certain way. But then this language is inappropriate to describe that, I guess.
I'm not sure I know what a program designer is. Who is such a person?
It's a position, it's not a person. It can be occupied by many people. Anybody who actually writes a syllabus for a course is a course designer.
Right, so I'm not sure what the problem. I mean, the only people who design curricula for me are faculty members. I don't know where this contradiction is supposed to be. You have to teach your faculty members how to think in the terms that you want them to think in. They're not separate people they can't be separate people from program designers. What the hell is a program designer anyway? I've never heard of such a thing.
All right. Okay, so then
Just get rid of them completely. Just essentially get rid of your whole. What you want to do is merge your two slides. The idea that there's somehow two separate groups of people is where the problem lies.
No.
Now, the fact that you can't get that a lot of faculty members don't want to think in these terms.
Yeah.
That's your job as the person who runs the university to make them think in these terms.
Well, Andrew, you spent a lot of time with us in Skolkovo, so the distinguish between position and the role, right? So think of that as two positions within the head of a single person.
But you've got them in separate boxes. You've got them in separate boxes.
What should I put in
at the very least, you could make a Venn diagram so that there was some overlap between those two things. I mean, that would be like a minimum. The fact that there are a certain percentage of your faculty who will never be able to think in any kind of sort of comprehensive terms about what kinds of competencies they want, and the fact that maybe there's some eggheads who aren't faculty members who are going to help them do that, maybe. But I would at least like a Venn diagram and the recognition that in the end, faculty members have to learn how to do this. In the contemporary university, if they don't, the university will be closed. I agree with that, and it should be closed. But in the end, they're the ones who have to do it, and we have to. If we know how to, if there are some of us who are better at it or more advanced at it, we have to teach them how to do it.
Okay, Andrew, imagine that this figure on the right, which is called program designer, that's a bad term, I agree, is part of the mind of your faculty member which was influenced by you as a president of the university. So actually you shall teach them how to do that. They have been taught, but they cannot be taught, they're not completely convinced that they should think in terms of competences because they also believe in negative capabilities and things like that, which presumably
I don't care as long as they can tell me, we're going to talk about it when our group meets, but as long as they can tell me where, if we agreed on the competencies that we want to make sure our students get, if they can show me where in their curriculum, either their individual course or their curriculum as a whole, where these competencies get taught, I don't care what else they do. They can spend the rest of their time thinking about negative capability.
Okay, all right, yeah, but this is the next step. The first step is to convince them that they actually have to think about competencies.
Well, the advantage I have is I can fire them, so that's a big advantage.
Thank you. Any question? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Group number 2.
I think Peter.
Okay. I'll stand up for this, I think. Now, we did not necessarily arrive at a position of certainty, which is obviously we're trying to map one of the things that we're trying to induce. But we're going to try and talk a little bit more about some of the questions that you raised earlier. And we're going to focus on three things. Firstly, maybe getting beyond the language of competency in measuring or evaluating assignments. And you can introduce the word care. I'm going to talk more about negative capability, because this was something that came up. I think it's wonderful. It's made its way onto another team's slide, which means it obviously has purchase. It was an idea John introduced, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, and the problems with this idea, and particularly whether it can be taught or not, or what its role is in the classroom. And finally, we're going to address that question, that really interesting question at the end, which was Andrei's question, which is how could you write a syllabus that tried to bring in these models, or this idea of negative capability. These are the same slides we had earlier. They're not the same ideas, they've moved on a little bit, but I'm going to skip to our slide here. First is this issue of care. We talked earlier about the problem of where the language of competencies breaks down. If there's a moment in which talking about attainment or writing an assignment in terms of competency does not seem adequate to the exercise. And I talked about, writing a brilliant essay or a first-class essay, and me saying, well, it needs to be an original argument, and the student saying, well, how can I produce competency in doing that? And I say, well, I can't, I'm not sure. And one idea was that actually the word care might be a model. for thinking about that kind of pursuit of excellence in writing an essay, that it's not necessarily that you've achieved a certain level of competence, but that you've cared and showed an investment in a topic to an extent or a degree that you are able to navigate, and this is you're able to navigate within that topic. You'll be able to deal with the complexities of that topic and come to some kind of critical view within them. And care, I suppose, as a model is interesting because it's open-ended. We think about care for a child. It's something which is active, responsive to the child's needs, right? It's not something that we're saying, right, this is how it's going to be. It's more like... and it doesn't have necessarily a set purpose to produce X. It's more to respond to the challenges of this thing. So caring for something, it's a model. It could break down as well, but I find it's interesting to propose it as a language for talking about excellence in education, which is not competency. You know, how far have you cared? How far have you shown an investment and a care for something, and what does that produce? Back to negative capability, this was the idea that we raised earlier, which is, as I say, navigating with learning to deal with irreconcilable problems, learning to cope with the dissonance of the fact that there are paradoxes which we cannot solve, and that a lot of education is throwing yourself into a position of, or embracing a position of uncertainty and navigating within that rather than coming to a fixed position on it. And the question was whether you can elicit this, or how do you teach this embracing your own ignorance or your own incapability? How can you elicit this? And we had two kind of views on this, and so I'm going to pass over to, should we have you can't elicit it first, maybe that'd be more fun. John believes that, although believing in negative capability, would like to offer a position on the challenge of eliciting this in the classroom.
I mean, it's not. I do believe that you can elicit negative capability, but I think there are some hard limits on the extent to which people can manifest it. And I think negative capability is closely connected to general intelligence, and that people have more and less of this, more or less of this, depending on their genetic inheritance and their environmental circumstances. And you can create conditions in which you can bring it out, but there are some hard limits on it. And I gave an introductory statement yesterday in which I said that I thought that there were too many people going to university who didn't have an intellectual passion and didn't and were out of place in the traditional university classroom, and that some of these people should go to vocational schools where they can learn concrete competences. And that actually I think that negative capability was perfectly well facilitated within the traditional university classroom in the days when fewer people went there. So I mean, I think I don't think we need a radically innovative model of education. I think there are some resources from the past that we can draw on, but the reason I asked Andre the question a little while ago about whether it was possible to reimagine the university paradigm within his language of competences was because I think that in order to optimize people's negative capability, that's precisely what we need to do. And I'll just add as an addendum to that I realized that when I was talking about negative capability afterwards, I was conflating two different ideas that are very similar from two different writers that I've been reading recently. One was Keats's idea of negative capability, and one was a very similar statement by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And he was the guy who said, the mark of a first-class mind is the ability to hold contradictory ideas at the same time and still function. Keats was actually talking about something that's involved in the business of writing poetry, when you get strange ideas and images that pop out of your imagination and you're not sure what to do with them, and he's suggesting that you should go with them and see where they lead in a state of uncertainty without any irritable reaching after fact. And I think these two ideas are closely related, but Keats's idea involves the faculty of imagination, and Fitzgerald's idea is more about what we might call bandwidth. But these are, these are faculties that not everybody has, and if you have in your classroom a lot of people who do not have these faculties to a high degree, you're going to be hampered in your ability to elicit it from the people who do have the potential to manifest these things.
Okay, so that's one side. One of us was going to argue the other side, perhaps Sharon?
I don't know that we're, completely on opposite sides, but I think that as we were talking about the project of the university and the project of undergraduate education and who can have success in that environment and who is able to reach a level or be changed through the process of undergraduate education, with more people coming to the university with the original intention of getting a certificate so that they can enter the job market in a different way than someone without a BA. Yes, there's definitely a role for technical schools and, just competency-based things, but that the students who have put themselves in that situation have demonstrated some form of openness to the possibility of change within themselves, and that any classroom, and we'll talk about, the syllabus that we've come up with that has, this potential, that anybody who's put themselves within that place can reach a position of negative capability within some discipline, and whether that discipline is, English literature or the negative capability, within the, some other technical aspect that's demonstrated within the syllabus, that all of those students have a worthy place within the university.
Fantastic. So generally speaking, that where we are agreed is that maybe the competency model doesn't allow for the accepting of your own limitations, that it creates an illusion that things can be mastered, when a lot of the time they can never be mastered. It's learning as a process, which is always the deferral of the finding of the true meaning. You're just finding new questions and opening up further questions. So that's where we agree that there needs to be some accommodation of uncertainty and strangeness, and reaching out to something beyond what you could conceive as being masterable or mastery in the classroom. Finally, we did think about syllabi, and we thought about the paradox here that one argument would be actually a lot of people already have syllabuses which do this anyway, right? They already build in, like students will find their way towards their own negative capability, or find themselves towards the unanswerable paradoxes, and realize that education is always this process of uncertainty. Like research seminars are a classic example. Study your own research project, keep going. I, as the professor, will keep suggesting new readings, and then eventually you'll get to a stage where you're at the frontiers of knowledge and so on, and you're confronting the uncertainties, and you're not mastering something, right? But we did hypothesize another kind of course, and I'm going to pass over.
So, obviously, there's nothing that radical about the course, but the idea of the course tries to explicate how more variables could be brought in, and how we could germinate the conditions of possibility for something like negative capability. So because essentially we do believe that it cannot be taught, at least not positively taught. So the idea here is to, let's say, take a Introduction to Film and Media Studies course. And so one component of this is, of course, the experiment, the experiential, wherein my idea of provincializing also comes in. So film is not just a product, media is not just a product that you consume, that you simply watch either in a big theater or on your portable screens. There are nuts and bolts behind it, there is the mechanics behind it. So the idea is to, for example, take the students to a theater, watch the film with them, or divide them into different groups. One group watches the film in a communal space, the other group watches the film privately, try and establish a dialogue across them. Now, in more India-specific examples where class distribution is so stark, there are single-screen rundown theaters where, for example, the kind of films I research are screened, Bhojpuri films that I'm talking about, where the experience of watching a film could be radically different from anything I'm assuming you would have ever seen. So people being policed into the theater, they being disciplined throughout the process of the screening, actually shunted out, dirtying the place. Some would actually be sleeping in the theater, because these are all working class audience for vernacular film industry. So experiences of that sort, but also a sense of how the projectionist version of projection, or the theater manager's version of what the exhibition industry struggles are, what it stands for, etc. are. So there is this side of it, where you try and ground cinema in its mechanics. The other is, of course, the academic side of it, where you try and introduce what have been the key tendencies, key debates within the academic literature around mostly art cinema. And of course, watch art cinema along with documentaries, etc., in class and otherwise. And let's say at one point in the middle of the course, you ask the students to write the first paper about the Bergmans and the Tarkovskys in relation to the literature they've read. And as an overall dynamic debate, introducing a different problem at the other end of the course, after you also watch some popular cinema, and introduce this conflict that in a sense is omnipresent, that popular culture generates much more mass euphoria, much more interest, as opposed to art cinema. So, towards the end of the course, the students could be asked a big question: why is it that we like the films that we like? So now you write a paper more or less on popular cinema in relation to what you have already argued on art cinema, and try and balance out the arguments in relation to the other factors that you have taken note of during the course. Not only the academic literature, but also the experiential side, the economic side of things, and your own stake. And through that, negatively confront the idea of care. Because like we were discussing, it's nearly impossible to positively introduce care. But it is possible to make the student confront what one doesn't really care about, or what one cares about only within the classroom because of its careerism, because of its academic trajectory, because it allows you to address a gap which allows you to plug into an academic career. But you don't really care about it. Or you could actually come up with an argument where you say that popular culture does produce better films. So that's simply that. But taking that position would also be productive. So this is not to say that there is a definitive outcome that I'm expecting as an instructor. The idea is to engage with this deep-seated conflict which is out there, and which brings university as a space in conflict with the world outside.
Thank you. But you have no time, fortunately.
It's just the last kind of.
Okay.
Please don't ask us what is novel about this, because really nothing is. Learning is happening, education is fine in many places, and we already care, whether our students care, we already practice negative capability. So it's not the call for reformation, it's just the description of how education is really structured. And the only conclusion that could be derived is that we have to do those things better.
Any questions, comments?
I must confront the same question all over again, but I will just as well just ask it one more time. So, like that example in this film course, right? This is, in our terminology, that's an educational instrument, like sending students to working class film theater or sending them elsewhere. That's analytical reasoning in the sense that you really, they read all kinds of texts, right, analytically. It's also a skill of not thinking dogmatically and assuming that there is only one point of view which is right and that's your own. You also should realize the otherness, and also should take into account the assumptions that you take for granted before you make a certain conclusion, which is just GRE test, by the way. And then you put it all that, you have an object, which is film, and they write a good essay, which shows all these competencies that they have developed. Where is this nebulous negative capability?
We want to facilitate the possibility of it, but we don't need to. we're fine to satisfy the competency requirements of students and institutions that want that. But we also want to facilitate the possibility of this more mysterious encounter that doesn't get explained away and doesn't get closed up. And we actually don't care. I don't care if it gets called.
I want to
this
take
or that.
eigenvalue of that, right? So, okay, something we can measure and can see. So imagine you have two student papers. One of them remained on the level of mere competencies, which I described, and the other showed what Duskin thinks they want at least some of the students to succeed in. How you tell the difference between the two essays?
No, you don't. You can't. In fact, you may not know that it happened unless the student tried to tell you about it. I think this is what I tried to call the trust in the previous presentation. I think there's an implicit aspect of our thinking about education that a part of it is actually trusting that there are a bunch of interesting and, for me, compelling outcomes that are not immediately quantifiable.
I completely disagree with Duskin on this, and I mean, I do think there are some basic competencies that you can teach in a film class. You can teach somebody how to, or you can attempt to teach somebody how to structure an argument, or you can talk to them about writing thesis statements, and so forth. And some students will do this. Some students will do this better than others. Occasionally, you'll come across an extraordinarily able student who will do something radically original in the class. And they're not operating according to a formula in that case. They are exemplifying these qualities of negative capability that I took from F. Scott Fitzgerald and John Keats. And you know, the people who exemplify this quality, most of all for people like Keats, are the great artists. And these are people who didn't just, write within a field of competencies, but they redefined the fields. And of course, this is not something that we should expect our students to do, but it's something that we should have in mind, and we should make them aware of, that there are people who do this, and that and some students will aspire to this, and maybe some students will even achieve it. And we can be mistaken about whether somebody is displaying genius or displaying or just being insane in some of the things that students sometimes produce. And we talked a little bit earlier about some of the students that we have here in SAS, and I can identify some students who were writing essays that it wasn't really possible to give a high grade to in the first year, but in whom I could see that there was some very deep thought going on that they hadn't yet found a way to express. And then I can think of some other students who wrote essays that maybe got the same grade, but you could see that they just did not have the equipment to do the kinds of tasks that we were asking them to do. And most of them are not here anymore, I would say. So, yeah, you can teach competencies, but...
And you can distinguish between the two essays.
I thought I could distinguish between the two, and I think my feeling at the time has been borne out in that the student whom I thought was doing some deep thinking that she hadn't yet figured out how to express is still with us, and some of the other students aren't. And in fact, she got very high grades on some of the exercises that she did recently that I was privy to. So, I think negative capability is something that can't be operationalized exactly, but you can create circumstances in which it might emerge, and you can show people examples of it. And you as a teacher can maybe sometimes exemplify it in the classroom when you're maybe teaching great books and you're showing people that there are different ways that you can make a good argument about a particular theme, like justice or the existence of God, and you can show how two completely different positions on this might both be good, and you can think about the questions that are raised by the fact that both of these arguments are good. And one of the competencies that we try to teach students that I think borders on going beyond competencies into negative capability is how to ask pregnant questions about the things that we're interested in the class. How do you ask questions that open up to all kinds of other avenues of investigation, and when are you asking questions that just have a single boring answer?
If I could add to that. So obviously, I don't think you can, in all cases, identify two separate essays and say, here is negative capability. But the way I would look at it at the BA level is the adventure of thinking. And I'm not just introducing a new phrase or variable. it is, I mean, for example, let's say you have discussed 30 variables in the classroom or in your outside classroom teaching, and you see a student actually introduce a new variable from outside this bracket. I would say that here is a sign, at least a sign, of the adventure of thinking being pursued. So there are always signs where you can see, because at the end of the day, this is about introducing the drive for care, like Peter was saying, for something that is by definition a surplus. Negative capability, at least how I've understood it, it's a surplus. You can never really put your finger down on it, but surplus may or may not happen. But there are always traces that it will leave, which you can actually see through. Now, of course, there are negative capabilities. Sorry, but I mean, a different kind of surplus can be generated out of a course. So a lot of my initial classroom experience was driven by this hostile anger against what was being taught. And I think that drove me. But I won't say that was an intended outcome of the course. So one could take that route as well. But certainly, there are, when you take film and media from within its given bracket 2 steps outside, and you see the student taking the 3rd step, you see a sign. And I think you can spot that 3rd step very often.
There's an extent to which it seems, maybe not entirely intentionally, that you're looking at this like an on-off switch. Like either the person achieves, activation energy and the nuclear reaction happens, or they don't, and the nuclear reaction doesn't happen. But I somehow doubt that's really what occurs when we teach people, regardless of whether it's we deserve the credit for it happening but it happens and it doesn't happen, even in the same student, right? The student is sort of kind of original, or in this case, somehow blindingly original, right? I mean, it's a spectrum, not an on-off switch. Maybe it's like a light with a dimmer switch. So that your goal is not to say we're trying to teach people to be geniuses, because we know we can't do that. And it's also not to say we're saying we're not going to be completely happy if all they do is just repeat the kinds of arguments, even if they're complicated arguments, that we give them. We want to see something more. And John, when you say that, not all students are capable, I agree. Certainly not all students are capable of achieving the maximum that we want of a great student. I doubt they were ever always capable of that, even when the university was smaller and more elite and more difficult. There's always going to be a spectrum. Yes, it's true there may be some students who are utterly incapable of that. And in a program like yours here, you probably do want to get rid of them because there's no real place for them. Lots of other universities, there's a place for them. I mean, there's room for students like that it's not just a question of technical schools. Again, it's not an on-off switch. So to me, I think all you're saying is there are students who are better and there are students who are worse. And hopefully as faculty members, we can recognize the difference between the students who are better and worse and encourage the ones who are better to be even better than they start out, and encourage the ones who are worse to be a little better than they currently are. And that's what we can produce, right? I mean, there's some level of humility we have to have towards what we can do, but still some idealism towards the goal that, somehow in an ideal world, all students should do that, but we know all students are not going to do that.
That's pretty much my position, yeah.
And I would just also add that, we talked about care at the level of the instructor or the teacher as well, and having that motivation to continue to invest in those students who can benefit at the margins and might achieve, marginally better than they were at the beginning, and that is worth it as part of our, job as teachers.
I would also add that it's not really about enhancing only certain students. The idea was that higher education at large should push a student from exercising negative capability as a mode of thinking in the safe environment of the classroom, which is uncomfortable, but I can kind of stomach it for an hour, to the mode of thinking that is a norm. When you graduate. So every graduate should be absolutely comfortable with switching from negative capability to care and switching between ideologies and paradigms within negative capability.
No, every student, if you set that up as your goal, you will automatically fail in the vast majority of cases. And it's a very bad idea to set yourself up to fail. I mean, I remember when I took over as graduate dean, and I was told, I asked my departments, how do you define a successful outcome of a PhD program? And almost all of them said, the person gets a job at a Research One university. And I said, look, you are well aware that only 10% or 15% of your students are going to get jobs at Research One university. So that means 85% of your students are failures? This is not a good way of looking at the world, right? You can't start thinking that, and if you say the goal of university education is that every student can do this, bullshit. Every student can't do this, even at the best universities in the world. And your job is to get more of them to do it, and more of them to do it more frequently. To say that's your goal is to create every student who's going to do this, come on, be real. What world do you live in?
That's a real normal goal. Let's bring an example.
No, it's not
from
a goal that
different
can't be
sphere.
achieved. Is not a goal.
Say, okay, we're talking about an ultra marathon, and I'm an organizer. I want every participant to finish. I know for a fact that some will not, but I want everyone to do that.
Sorry, no,
I mean, John has said he agrees with you. I agree with you. I don't know about the rest of the group, but I mean, just in that's fine. But I mean, I think ultra marathon organizers also they push people as hard as they can go, and there's never the goal that everyone finishes. In my, minor reading of the area.
The Barclay marathons, like the Barclay marathons, where only one person finishes every year, but 300 people enter, and that's the point.
Yeah, but if you don't strive for them, if you're just okay, we had 1,000 students graduating, only one actually got good in that. And we are okay with that. No, we should not be okay with that. We should strive for everyone to do it. And fine, we fail, 20%, 30%. But striving and achieving are different things.
You should strive at more. You should have some goal that is a realizable goal. More of our students will achieve that than
Two,
before.
not one, two.
2 is
That's
better, 3 is
good
better,
now.
5 is better, 10 is better. To say our goal is to have 1,000, forget about it. You'll never succeed. And you'll know you'll never succeed, and you will then get burned out completely because you'll sit there and say, oh my God, we had to have 1,000 students succeed, and only 10 have succeeded, so we're horrible failures. When in fact, 100% more students have succeeded than used to succeed, so you're total successes. It's all a question of setting yourself up for something you can actually do.
I think we're just in
you're
different
you're
paradigms.
You're going to totally burn out. You can't survive this way.
I'm idealistic, you're managerial. We can never agree. It's impossible. Let's stop.
Okay, there is something I don't understand about your vision. So sometimes it sounds like you have a kind of a series of more and more complex, interesting competencies, and then the question is where you draw the bottom line, who you actually cull. It's called culling. I think, Erica introduced that word. So where this line is, right?
Sorry,
And
what
then
was that word?
Culling. It's minimum, so if there's
Yeah.
below minimum competency, you cull.
Okay, and then you have a spectrum, of which actually Andrew is talking, right? And you can hope that more of them will be at the top. But on the other hand, you say, well, no, care and negative capability is something unmeasurable. What's good about competence is that you can measure it. You can actually introduce a test. Say, well, he can do that, the student can do that, cannot do that. If it's something unmeasurable, something you can intuitively fill in their papers or in their conversations, but you cannot actually pinpoint in a text and say, well, this is where it is, but it's not, then it's impossible to actually use that for culling. So the student who wouldn't be doing good in terms of competences, you have to take the student away, right? Because this is the test, so to speak, or this is the rules of the grade. And then, right, so how can you possibly make sure the students who have this potential for negative capability stay in the program, if the only way you can actually call them is by measuring their competencies, and negative capabilities is not just the sum of competencies but something entirely different?
Well, there's a dialectic of quantity and quality, and if intelligence is on a spectrum, it's possible to cull people at a certain level at the lower end of the spectrum, and to recognize that at a certain point higher up on the spectrum, quantity becomes quality, and there are, as people become more and more able for the kinds of things that we're trying to get them to do in the classroom, it's no longer possible to measure them against each other. I mean, how do you measure, Keats against Coleridge or something like that, to take an extreme example? But two students can be doing something very intelligent and original without us being able to rank them, and there are limits to the kinds of ranking that we do in grading. I mean, if two students get 10 in our grading scheme, it's possible that one is far better than the other, but our grading scheme only goes so far, and we don't need to measure them beyond that.
I mean, we just a simple point, but we don't need to cull them if they're not reaching the high bar. I mean, I think competent usually functions as a word for getting by in a lot of humanities subjects. Oh, this was a competent paper. I mean, in common parlance, it was a competent paper. No one's saying that's an excellent paper, but we're not going to say, oh, it was only a competent paper. We'll cull them, because they didn't do negative capability or whatever. I mean, I think that in praise of high bars, I mean, shoot for the goal of more people thinking in this kind of way, which defies a simplistic measurement. And invites a more complex measurement of engagement, care, whatever you want to call it. Shoot for that, and then not many people get it, but we don't have to cull them. I mean, I think in the British grading system where it goes up to 100, but the record high grade each year is 78, and it's unheard of for anyone to get 85, right? And why does that extra 15 exist? Maybe, I don't know. It's to recognise that there are. It's a very, very high bar. I don't know. There's something to be said for that kind of unattainable high bar, which drives the whole. Up. I don't know. It's just my point.
I just wanted to add that, I mean, I do understand some minimum bar of competency as the cutoff level. That is absolutely fair, at least for me personally. But you're not using that adventure of thinking as a criteria to mark students. That is a surplus, and that is to be marked up, not marked down. Now, one thing in my experience of teaching I have realized is that you always try and measure a student's performance in the second paper with his or her own first paper, instead of an invisible mark of evaluation that you create for them. So very often you would see that surplus materialize into something if you are looking at that trajectory, instead of comparing students across the class. Looking at the student's own progress is a much better criteria. The other part that it's related to is that, in my experience and even otherwise, students are very good at reading the minds of the course, and figuring out whether the course expectation is in the very dull, mechanical, repetitive bracket. When they see you want that, they give you that. The idea is for the instructor to show the adventure of thinking on his part, so that their adventure can be summoned. I mean, if that sounds nebulous, I'm sorry, I can't help it, but I think that's very, very clear to me. I mean, so you summon that adventure only by doing something special yourself, not by just being demanding. That do something special. I ask you 5,000, why don't you write 7,000 by yourself? And I'll say, oh, wow, that's great. It's reciprocal, and it's important to acknowledge that reciprocity.
Other questions? Okay, thank you. Team number 3, or Would you like to say something?
No, you start. You start.
Is this on? Yes. Okay, so we're the team who presented on a set or a new set of competences or a set of new competences, whatever we call this. And we decided this time to rework our vision of what we want to say, basically, and to be more focused and more specific. So we would like to offer you, and maybe get some feedback from you on this idea of introducing a new format. Maybe it's not that new, you tell us, but a format of for the students to develop certain competences, which I will refer to later in the presentation. So this is basically, we think, should be done, the task should be done within, irrespective of an educational program, be it about biology or anthropology, social anthropology, or linguistics, whatever. So the task would be for the students to go on a mission, so to speak. We think it could be a year-long enterprise, as I said, irrespective of students' specialization. And they will have to get some credits for what they do, what they will do within this period of time, within some courses which are mandatory. So the task is to go on a mission, let's call it social mission, to try and do something real, like to make a real, even if it's a small scale, but a real contribution to the development of their city, or a particular community in the city, or just try to figure out what problem the city or a particular community or even a company is facing at a certain point in time when they enter the university. And they will have to basically do everything on their own. They will have guidance, they can have guidance from tutors or from teachers themselves, but they will have to self-organize on their own completely, and to do their research, basically, to do their an exploration of what it is and how they're going to do this. It's up to them. And we suggest, I mean, it's still a raw kind of idea, but we suggest they keep self-reflection diaries on a weekly basis, let's say, both individual and group. And they also are supposed to come together, let's say, every week for a group discussion of what they have done, what progress that they have made. And they decide actually on which basis they should do this, on a weekly or, let's say, once a month. But I think it should be, because they are young, maybe, and inexperienced, maybe a weekly basis. And a tutor or a teacher would attend and observe, taking down notes of what's going on in the classroom, but will never intervene directly. So they are supposed to do this task, to explore the problem, to find it, basically, to formulate it and to explore this and to record their experiences along the way. And every decision made at any point in the project implementation should be justified. They have to bear this in mind, that every single step that you make has to be justified, and they will have to be able to explain what they did and why they did. Well, they will explain what they did, but why? Based on what evidence or, I don't know, sources, and so on. So as I said, tutor and teacher support could be provided along the way, but it shouldn't be like guidance. It can be guidance depending on the situation, but it shouldn't be necessary. Shouldn't be that. So it's just an experiment, really, for everybody, I guess. But we're supposed to be. We would like to be radical, at least in this sense. We will be new. Our presentation will contribute something new. So, and basically, they will have to act in a situation of, you can imagine, complete uncertainty, limited resources, if at all, limited time. Well, a year I think it's a good period of time. Maybe it's quite a long time, but yet, it will depend, but it's still limited, I guess, maybe for some issues to be tackled. Limited knowledge, definitely, if at all, again. And so some of the competences that we believe that can develop through this experience are self-organization, the ability to actually come together and to figure out what to do. I mean, each and every step of the way is to be figured out, really. So self-awareness and awareness of others, other people's needs within your group, with their group, and the needs that they will become aware of during the project implementation. Their own limitations. I mean, they will figure probably out along the way who's the leader, and it's okay if you're not a leader, but you can do something else, and you can contribute in a different way, but still very useful way. So they will figure that out, and it's okay for themselves. They will become more aware, I guess, of the problematicity of getting a real thing done. I hope we'll be able to realize that nothing is to be taken really for granted in terms of resources, for example, and stuff. Also, independent, intense learning through experiences on their own and collectively. So this is indeed independent, very autonomous in a sense, kind of learning experience. I'm sorry, and so. And the last thing we think, well, basically it's, they will hopefully will have this sense of satisfaction of having done a real thing. So they will have real positive contribution made, and maybe even measurable contribution. So by the end of this project, they could either on their own, or maybe teachers or tutors could do that project assessment. So probably tutors or teachers could do that. I'm not sure, but they will. They themselves will have to keep track of what's going on and assess what was useful, what was not, what was productive, resulted fruitful or not. And they will have to collect some feedback from the stakeholders or the participants of this experiment, just to bring it as an evidence that they made a real impact, or whatever impact they will make. And maybe they could also assess, make an assessment of possible long-term impact of what they did, what they have done, and then in the end they could present the project, and there could be like maybe part of a coursework even, present it and defend it. There could be a board of assessors, expert people, or even some of the stakeholders, and they could discuss this whole experience all together. So this is the idea that we have come up with. New competencies, I don't know. Sorry, it's not new.
So I just also want to add, I mean, this morning when this group presented, I think the problem was that everybody asked them to do what isn't necessary to do. So to say these competencies pretty much everybody agrees on, so you can disagree on one or two of them, you can take one or two of them out, you can add one or two different ones, it's pretty much irrelevant. That the basic idea that the competencies that they were proposing are fine, and there's no need to sit around and come up with some hair-splitting philosophical grounding for why they're fine. They're fine because we all know they're fine. Everybody agrees they're fine. And if there's one people don't like, they can take it out, and if there's one they want to add, they can add it. So the question is not, do you have the appropriate question is not, do you have a philosophical, deep philosophical grounding to explain why you have these competencies? The question is, how can you actually get people to show that they have indeed, over the course of some academic program, developed these competencies, and they don't necessarily have to each one be developed in each course they take or in each activity they do. But overall, we want to be sure that, and we can create some kind of, this was like a capstone project type course, but there's other ways you can measure these things. But so instead of wasting our time hair splitting about the philosophy behind them, I think the point of this group was to say, okay, how do you actually make it happen? Poor Juliet, who left in a like feeling faint and sick because we started to think about how she could actually do this in her biology program. Poor girl who has to come up with some way of introducing many of these competencies into a program that in some respects seems to resist some of them. And the question is, how do you actually do it? So I think that's what we sat around discussing, was more like, how do you get it done than what should it be?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I just didn't understand exactly what the course is about, or how it's just, can you just give a short description of the course, like in the syllabus, what students do in that capstone course?
They decide on their own.
So just because, I mean, the only thing I understood is that students are kind of left on their own to do something.
May I give you probably a small example? Yeah? It is a project where I participated. The project was held in Georgia, in Tbilisi, and a group of students, they elaborated the routes around the city based on the memories of the people who suffered during Stalin times. And so it was very combinated, so very complicated job, because they had first of all to find these people, then to make interviews with them, then to build this route. They all these things they did absolutely independent. Yeah? They had to combine the history and architecture, because it was route. And so things like this. And by the end of the project, it was the product which could be somehow transferred further. And afterwards, after such several projects, they made a small organization which is called now Soviet Lab. And so they gather such personal stories and move with this job further. Did I explain a little bit? It's one of possible examples.
Yeah, I mean, we have this course, it's called Design Thinking course. When they go around the city, make some projects, or go to Tobolsk, and it's a little bit structured because there's this kind of come in instruction, just visits 3 times. I wouldn't say this is a course that really shows everything they've developed over the course of the program. I mean, they develop certain skills, which are important, but it's, I mean, how is it the capstone project? For example, how can they use the ability to, anyway, so I mean, they choose the project themselves, right? I think that's
Yes,
your
exactly.
idea.
That's what I wanted to stress.
So this project they choose is usually extremely stupid. That's what students do. They choose stupid projects. Like, well, how can I make something that people, when it's cold outside and they wait on a bus stop and they kind of feel cold, so makes this kind of little device where they can warm their hands.
I agree.
Okay, that's
yes.
nice.
I
How
agree.
how is it about negative capability?
I agree with this, but in this case, if a cohort is not that independent, or I mean, if the thinking is a little bit shallow at the moment, but you can still you just provide more guidance as teachers. It could be actually a collective course that you can teach together.
So you should tell students what to do.
Then yes. Guide them, not just tell, but guide them, give them hints or something like that. Yeah.
So I actually think you kind of fallen prey to this worldly infatuation with project-based learning, which is going on. It's kind of like a triumphant march, which is taking over Europe. Do you really think that's always the best way to demonstrate a competency or to learn it? What about just playing? I mean, Gamification. What
Sure.
about simulations?
Sure, absolutely. It's just one of the ways.
Why do you focus on it?
To be honest, I'm aware of the project-based learning rhetoric and practice, but we haven't thought about this when we came up with this idea. The motivation and drive behind this was to actually make them experience the world. I mean, the world sounds very general, but experience problems as they are out there, and learning as it happens in a most natural way. You can have simulations. You can model, sure, but John also mentioned that you can't model everything. You can't model some experiences. You can have this as an additional method. I mean, technique. We don't say that's the best way to do things and to teach things. No, it's just one of the. But the idea, I want to stress this once again, it's the social kind of focus for them to be aware of what is going on outside the university, in the society they're gonna, they will gonna have to work at some point to live, basically.
So, I mean, I wasn't really part of these discussions, but I will say, I mean, a one-size-fits-all thing that every single person has to do is not going to work, for sure. It's not going to work. So essentially, if the goal is to say we have this set of competencies that we want students to show at the end of their course or to have learned, they learn some of them in there, or they achieve some of them in terms of their individual classes. They achieve some of them in terms of their overall program, and we should be able to point out where they achieve various of them. And then somehow they're going to synthesize them in some form. Could it be a traditional academic paper done by one student? Sure, it could. I imagine it could. Would these guys prefer it to be a group project? Okay, it can be a group project. The main thing is to say, as long as you've mapped out what it is you want the students to be able to do, you want their final project to show that they're doing a bunch of those things and doing them in a kind of interesting and ideally somewhat original, again, not like a light switch you turn on and off, but with some level of originality and some level of passion that they're showing towards what they do. Is everybody going to achieve that? No, not everybody's going to achieve that. Are certain groups going to do a better job than others? Is there some minimum level of showing that we want? Yeah, there's a minimum level. There's a kind of middle level we're likely to see. There's going to be some that are just totally brilliant and spectacular. That's fine. So I don't think the goal is to say, here's the one thing everybody has to do. I don't think that was your goal. This is an example of something that could be done, and there are other examples you could think of. And so the goal is to say, we have these competencies, show how you can deploy them. We know you've learned them over the course of your 4 years of education. Now show us what you can do with them.
I'm afraid I've lost the point of your group. So you said there are some really good competencies. Everybody agrees upon the importance of them. They can be learned in various ways. You should really take care for your students to learn them. And what is the point?
I think the point is most people don't do that.
So do it better, or make sure you do that.
Well, first start by agreeing that you should do it. If we agree that we should do it.
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any example of maybe you could just say, but honestly, I'm not aware of any examples of such. I wouldn't call, well, I called it project. No, it's just a mission, but it sounds too like, that's the word, just the word to describe the idea. That such thing was done, has been done anywhere.
I don't know, all Berkeley
Maybe,
University, the whole
maybe.
university is
Not in
based
Russia.
upon that. All in university, the whole university is based upon that. Skoltech utilizes that
No,
at
I
least
wouldn't
by
like to go into this.
50%.
No.
Design
it's
thinking
generalizing.
within SAS.
We are offering a pretty concrete thing this time, an idea, a format of doing things.
So what's
No, you're not offering that.
Yeah, I didn't get it either.
I just described the way that we could, but we can decide what kind of competencies you want out of the many that they out there to develop in your students through this format, and set the task. And if they're kind of, not capable of doing some things, provide guidance. But it has to be something that they do on their own, and they have to figure everything out for themselves. I know it's radical. I mean, I don't say that it can be implemented just right now.
It's radical. I think it's like every good course does that, right?
Like learning by
Yes,
doing.
it's not new.
It's centuries old.
Even great books course does that. I mean,
It's
this is
just
the
a format.
concept. Do it by yourself. Read the book. Think about it.
Yeah, I don't say it's an exceptional format. It's one of the possible ways of achieving our goals, pedagogical goals.
But I think, maybe that's not what you meant, but I think it was an important issue raised here. It's like the engagement of students with the real world.
Exactly.
And that's something that I find deeply problematic. Although we do that at
know.
SAS because stakeholders demand that.
Yes.
But I'm not sure we
imagine.
really have to be doing that. Why? Because, if you look at what's that college we were at in Ålin. No, not Ålin. We were in Denmark. Aalborg, yeah. Well, this is the way they structure the curriculum. They have a real-world problem. Like there was this. I spoke to a group of students. I think they were first-year students. They think, well, we design a VR device to help people overcome the anxiety of height. I said, okay, are you kind of psychologists? They say, no, we are not psychologists, but we're reading something about psychology, and we're also taking a course in psychology, so looking for anxiety. Okay, so also you are then VR specialists. I say, no, we don't know anything about VR, but we are reading some books, some stuff. We're learning how to do VR programming. And this is the way for them to not just to take any psychology course, but to take psychology course with a focus that is derived from their project, right? Or to take the VR course, not just to study VR design in general, but to design VR, which is about like space and things like that. Okay, that's meaningful. Maybe it's not the best. That's one of the ways to organize the individual trajectory. But that's not what you suggest, right? It's not that your students use this kind of capstone course to actually take other courses and get some knowledge. It's rather kind of a result. You think, well, if they studied well, then in their last year, they should be able to go to the real world and do something smart, right? And that's, I think, is deeply problematic because whenever people go to the real world, everything they studied becomes very reductive. It's kind of the opposite of a negative capability. I don't know, the level where complex thinking can be applied to the real world is not the level of a BA graduate. A BA graduate, if they want to maintain the complexity of their thinking, should be kept away from the real world and the real world problems.
I see your point.
That will immediately ground them to easy, stupid solutions. That's what I always our students are actually smarter than the actual world projects they're trying to do.
I see
because they
your point.
immediately kind of go back to this primitive, how to warm your hands thing.
Yeah, that's I agree. That's problematic in this sense, but they will have to live in this world. Not everybody will be able to, apply for. Not everybody will choose an academic career. Well, maybe, but not necessarily in the, somewhere abroad. No, maybe here in Russia, and they will have to then deal with and stay in Russia, work in Russia, and this is the reality that we have to deal with.
For us, MA is a transition.
But this creates this gap.
Education to professional.
This
stuff.
gap. I understand you, and I subscribe to this. Absolutely. But also I can imagine just how, and I've experienced this myself actually, just how painful it is when there is this gap and between the complex thinking and the real world situation, and you're really. You're at a loss. You don't know what to do with that, with that thinking. It's not easy to apply for a PhD, get funding abroad. I did get funding for an MA in the UK. I'm studying at Oxford right now, but it was really tough, and nobody can. No one can do this easily, and nobody will want to invest that. What about the rest, the 90% of other people, or maybe 80, 70, I don't know, who will not choose this way? They will have to live there, outside there. I know it's a problem. I don't know what the solution is.
I'd like to add some words. Coming back to our list of competencies, we discussed that it's a basic competencies. It's in spite of field of studies. I mean, it could be useful for engineers, for economists, because we all have different background and some different view how it's possible. Yeah, because if to say, for example, for economists, it's a very precise science and difficult to talk a lot, but not to understand correctly numbers. For example, if to consider balance sheet in accounting, it's it should know exactly what is it. And if to talk about, for example, competencies like creative thinking, I just give example. Theater performance, when students show different part of sheet balance, like revenues and expenditures, it's difficult to imagine how it's possible to present. Yeah, it's numbers and how it's calculated, and we discussed that these basic competencies, it should be in all of programs. And for bachelor studies, and maybe we didn't explain enough correctly what we mean for new competencies, because everybody knows these competencies and nothing new, but we didn't use these competencies, for example, in my university. Not one that we use right now. Maybe in the future we will, because we have some opportunity for specific university competencies, but now we didn't use. But yeah, use directly, yeah. And if to discuss with this auditorium some competencies, we can find a lot of experience, a lot of examples, which some competencies use in some places, for example, in USA, in Great Britain, and in some other places. But I think it's important to understand the way of is looking for and these competencies, how to determine this competence, how to teach this competence for our students, and to share some experience and some best examples how to do this. Because competences is a very complex a term, like we already all discussed this. It's knowledge, it's skills, it's ability, and it's reflection of results. And we need to think how to teach this competence. And in principle, it doesn't matter which one, because I don't know how it's possible to explain. It's important which one, but we should maybe to discuss and to find out some technology how to teach these competencies, because people, teachers, and some academic council, they will decide which one is more appropriate for some studies. But we need to find out the basic competence which is necessary for the next generation, for our young students, and then to discuss how it's possible to teach, to find some technology principles, methodology of teaching these competencies. That's my opinion.
Thank you for your ideas. Other questions? Comments? Okay, thank you. And we have final presentation, group number 4.
Let me start. we will do a step back from the competences, and you know that we will do it, but let me explain. I want to start from two things. The first one is from Marina's words in the previous presentation for the team, that actually the competences is very important for for marketing programs. So I disagree, because I think that it's almost impossible to sell competence, not history of success or something. And 2 hours ago, I witnessed the brilliant speech of Andrew on the summer school, where I think 100 young students who came from different cities of Russia prepare to do something here, to know something new, to have a chance to work with the best faculty here. But in fact, we all know that he's selling, SAS to many schools. How do you think? Remember Andrew's speeches about competences, about importance of competences here. How do you think? How many times he pronounced the word competence there, upstairs? At 0. But what he told, and it's important for our group presentation, what he told, the story of one of the teams of researchers here, so some kind of formation trajectory, how people from different universities combine together to discuss the very difficult issues like free will. And he asked people what free will is. By the way, nobody knows, and I think only 1/5 of those guys, children upstairs, believe that free will exists. Anyway. Huh?
Only 1/5 doesn't believe.
Doesn't believe. Yeah, doesn't believe. So it's reverse. Yeah, sorry. So then he provides some kind of guide, explained how it's organized, what they can see here, how the space organized here. So I think that for the student, because we want to start to talk from the student-oriented position, because students are clients. So and it's maybe rude, but also we want to teach. We really want to teach them and help them to be, the better people, better citizens, better professionals, and so on. So we will start from some, from some case, how we can combine different things beyond competences and success, and then we will say a couple of words about this most popular. It's twice more people, choose this point. I checked this by myself, cheating. So, more than 2/3 of audience want to hear about formation trajectories. We will say about this. And then at the end, I will tell a couple of words about the guides. So, Oksana.
Thank you. And as we are in the library right now, I have a book with me. Here it is. This book is a post-production or a result of a field trip of our students and faculty to two places very well known, Yasnaya Polyana, as Lev Tolstoy place, and Kulikovo Polye, which is essential for Russian history. And this book is not about Lev Tolstoy writing, and it's not about historical event. It's just sketches from our students talking with local people during 1 week. And what is this about? I will start from the very end of the story with this book. But 3 years, so Andrei, this is for you, for your library? And I have no idea where our discussion will be, but anyway. So some of you here in this library remember for sure what was this amazing student experience called kartoshka, or potatoes. Some of you may know this from books or other resources. That was a quite nice experience for students, first-year students, to be out from the university for maybe 2 or 3 weeks and helping our collective farmers to struggle with the harvest of potatoes. So it was nothing with the university or competences. So we decided, what about if we start these intellectual potatoes? So send pretty small groups from 8 to 15 students with faculty members to different destinations within Russian Federation and with a particular topic of their research. And to do this, we have no idea about competences. And to make this story true, you should apply and put the title, the topic of your research, field research, location, where you would like to go. The requirements to students, they might be from your own program or from any other program within the university. And the program for every day. That's all. No room for competences in this application form. We went on the very first field trip within the university because it was quite common practice for students and faculty members from, for example, cultural studies or philology department or linguistics. But it was absolutely new for law faculty, for computer science, for management, for economics. So that was the very first step to go beyond curriculum, beyond competencies, but still learning from the university. Let me say that now this is a part of the educational program. So students who participate in these field trips, they get credits, but they may choose any field trip which is open to everybody. And it very helps them in terms of, for example, formation trajectories, because I just put here some topics of these field trips, what they study within this 1 or 2 weeks. For example, rural communes who live beyond legal framework. They have no passports, they have no financial aid from the state, but they survive. How do they do this? Or what is the young people identity in different regions of Russia? Or what about the higher education in cities with one industry? Or it might be places of power. What is this about? Who knows? Maybe they know right now. Mystical places of power for students from all our faculties and departments and schools. So it was one topic, influence of Mundial to cities' landscapes. So everything that you can imagine was on the list. And students within these field trips, they're now more, how to say it, self-concerned. Our third group, you spoke about it, yes? About self-identified, yes? Who are they? They might have no idea that there will be researchers because they suppose that university is also only about didactics, not about real life. But they can find not only pretty nice places to visit, but also they can realize what might be their contribution to the country, to the local issues. Because it's not only about research. The result of this research should be, for example, the plan of new approach to teaching students with special abilities or something like this. So it should be the contribution. It's again, when it's designed, it's not about competencies, but just we'll try to show how it make our university as a club, as you mentioned, yes, with all these points, guide for students, formation trajectories, and you will find no syllabus where it will be a necessary part to participate in a field trip. No, but after that, you may feel it interesting.
Okay, I wanted to remind you the picture that Matthew did, but Matthew left. and took picture, I suppose, with him, because there is no more. You know, it's copyright. I think it's copyright issues. So let's continue to formation trajectories.
Okay.
We'll start.
Okay.
Ksenia.
Yeah, as a team lead of this kind of expeditions, we were last year in a very hard and difficult trip in these cities with one industry, bad ecology, very hard. Really very hard trip, and in the end of it, I've told my students, of course, we learned how to do interviews and participant observation, and we collected data about the higher education systems. But the main thing that we were like in a fairy tale. Why it's an fairy tale? Because like in a fairy tale, in the end of the story, a hero should not be the same like in the beginning of the story. And I think that the main thing about education and educational experience, it's a self-formation, and we're talking about the formation trajectories, and not to be the same person like in the beginning of your personal story. And we're thinking about how, me, Lina, and Kira, we were thinking about maybe some tools to organize these formation trajectories. Maybe we will do it, maybe not, but I think it's just a good starting point. So what to do with formation trajectories in university? And we've told in the morning that it can be activist trajectory, or academic, or political, or social, or artistic, or something like that trajectory. University maybe should, beyond the competence, to inform about them, to involve students, to navigate, and to help how to build this kind of trajectory. And next slide, yeah. And this is some units for maybe a future app, and it was Lina's idea to make an app, and these units should be there.
I can draw some concept. Okay, there is an application with 3 main elements. But maybe first elements, it is yeah, okay.
Black is the new red.
It's personal stories, and it is stories not for success, but for pleasure, maybe. There may be artist, maybe academic, maybe activist. And if some students associates himself with that person, that can read about his story and understand how he or she can build a formation trajectory. Another element of this application is test. Not serious test, but we think that there can be students who likes tests or some analytics, and they go to the test, and after that they understand some trajectory, and the test is related with these elements. And also maybe there are the students who want simply see all the opportunities. And there is actions, events, clubs, etc. elements of informal life of that university. and students can go there. And the elements is related, and if you analyze that, you can go after here. Or if you pass test, you can the result of the test can be linked with these elements. In general, we have system when students can navigate in the informal university life and build individual informal trajectory.
And also maybe a small manual how to survive in the university. And me and Lena, we were thinking about what type of activities can be in this third part, and we're trying to imagine a trajectory, not for an academic, I think everybody maybe know about it, but for artists. And we think that not only university clubs or students' unions should be there, but also the city projects and city internships, and because the connection with local community, with the city is very important. And I think it's the last thing that we wanted to talk about.
And I have to add that we speak mostly about the first year student and about the start of the career, when they try to choose what they will do at the university. And very important thing, we almost run out of time, so I will spend 1 minute to all of you have a competence to read, so you can see something on slide. I just want to say that if we decide to, if we start to change environment, and it's obvious because look around you, these colored seats, it's not very common, look for the university library in, in Russia, in Siberia, somewhere. Maybe for US or for Bishkek, it's looks, absolutely normal, but it's something new. So, but we have to change the ways we work with the first year students, how we try to inform them, how we try to show them, tell them about the rules and regulations here. And so I just, this is example for, it's not an ideal document, it's just a small example from Smolny, student's guide. And you see, all of you are quite familiar with the documents that, kind of documents, the правила обучения, so rules of, educational program, written by lawyers. And the same paragraph in these rules tells that the student must, before September 15, to do this, and this, to provide information to the director of educational program. If I'm a student, I start to be afraid. What if I've missed the date? Who is the director of educational program? I have no idea. Who is he or she or something? So what we try to do, it's in some informal, written without bureaucratic terminology, and sometimes funny from student point of view, from some recommendations made by students, senior students, just to retell these rules. You see, so this just, I think it's small letters, but this part, the green, is just recommendation from the second year students, and it said, don't be afraid. It's bracket, almost not boring, and who was bored? It was your friend who choose the classical, universities and classical faculties, not Smolny, and you will witness some kind of, So how to say ужас? I forgot the word. Horror, the Sartrean horror on this way, but again, обречены на свободу. Yes. But you condemn to freedom, and the thing is risky, but it's worth to risk. So it's very informal, written by students, a little bit edited, but not much. So an idea, but not every step, but most important things that first-year students needs to know about the university should be included in this kind of student guide or this manual how to survive on the campus. So it's what I wanted to say. And just to finish this discussion, our idea that we need to pay more attention to small things, the competences and philosophy behind the education. It's a big things, and we have big thinkers about these big things. The first team, the second team, the third team. But we ask you to stop for a moment and think about what small thing at your university, at your position, you can do next. Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, I mean, if you're in a position that you're a dean of education at Smolny or a president of a university and whatever idea comes to your mind is accepted, fine. You come up with these small ideas or bigger ideas, introducing your courses. Or if you're in a situation that there is very little initiative from the point of view of faculty and suddenly some faculty introduces something new, of course, you are so glad somebody thought of something original. Of course, you kind of support that. But imagine a situation then you have limited resources and all faculty are kind of introducing their small little things. How about sending students there, sending students there? How can I, for example, as a director, choose what to support if all these interesting, funny, or cool, or great initiatives are not framed in terms of competences that they develop? So I can say, well, I will choose this initiative over the other, not because it sounds funnier or kind of more interesting. What is interesting for whom, right? But because I see, well, it's actually more productive in terms of it kind of installs like 7 competences as opposed to 5 here.
Yeah. The first thing I have to say, as a director of the program, one of your main goals is to create effective environment for for all those competences. So forget for initiatives. And initiatives, you told that how one can know about a relationship between the initiatives and competences that you need to have. Nobody knows, but as I said before, 80% of your faculty have no idea about how the competences they put on the syllabus.
Okay, and how do I choose?
How do I ask people? Whom? Set some strategies. Invite us. Trust your faculty and trust your intuition and risk.
So you think a majority is always right?
But how you let me know how you decide to paint your library?
UNK decided that.
Huh?
UNK decided the colors.
UNK.
We approved it. Maybe we changed it a little bit with the vice rector for campus development.
Yeah.
So, what's the analogy?
So you had no influence into design of this.
No, we had influence.
Yes, of course. So you made some decisions.
Yes.
Make another decisions.
But the problem is that I'm not Hutchins or whatever, this mythological, charismatic director or university president or Andrew Wachtel, for that matter, who can actually say, well, I think it's right, I think it's wrong, this bullshit. And, people just say, yeah.
No.
You have lots of people who need some explanation and some justification, right? And if you are not the top kind of manager, you have managers above you, should say, well, this is why we do that, because this is this. And so far I only said, well, this kind of sounds cool, that's interesting to do. Why not do that? It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Try to do small things, smallest things. And then Then you will see the consequences and decide how.
Andrei, you just have to release your inner tyrant.
But, may I add?
That sounded surprisingly like psychotherapy. Okay, so my comment is in a completely different part of your presentation. So this app, is it meant for freshman students? Just clarifying. Okay. You said somewhere there that learning and living is kind of the same thing, or did I imagine it? Yeah, yes. Education is not a preparation for life, but life itself. So my point is, why are you concentrating only on traditional students? Wouldn't this app be actually more useful for people who come to a university for refill, as one Swedish university puts it, or who have kind of a lifelong subscription to a certain university, and they can, because students already sort of know this. I mean, they're inundated with all types of different messages from the university social nets and et cetera. They have friends, they have tutors, academic tutors who can advise them, and just tutors and psychologists and whatnot. But a person whose life is not inside a university at the moment, but who comes for refills on a regular basis, would need this way, way more. Just a suggestion, it's not a...
Any other?
May I add to what Andrei said? Because did you like our idea of these field trips, I wonder?
I don't know how I've been.
But
it's absolutely essential whether I like it or not. The question is whether I think it's
it,
good or not, and I have no reason, no instruments to judge, because you didn't explain to me what competences you are going to develop.
Do you like the idea? Would you like to participate? Can you imagine that for the first year we planned to have not more than 15 tours, because of finance restrictions, and we were waiting for, I know, at least 100 applications. What happens? We have +2 applications to the number of planned tours. So not so many people are so enthusiastic to step out of syllabus, step out of the zone of comfort, step out of the university, step out of the table of competences. So we will not be overwhelmed with this.
What is your point? It means that's a good initiative, it means it's a bad initiative.
No, I mean that when you asked what will be the basis for making decision to choose from the list.
His question was, why should you do it at all, not which ones should you choose?
Yeah.
How should he decide that this is a good thing to...
Imagine I'm Kuzminov, right? I know either I think, well, we should make this mandatory. This is very good, essential. Or we should actually not stop financing that, because we have other, more worthy ideas to spend university money on. Or should I leave it as it is, like this kind of limited initiative? Okay. I mean, which decision can I make, and what is the basis for my decision? If you didn't explain to me why you're doing that.
Yes, but what was the basis for your decision to send the whole first-year students team to St. Petersburg for 2 weeks?
I can list you a number of competences we are trying to develop.
In St. Petersburg, special St. Petersburg competences.
Yes.
It's impossible to develop in Tyumen, Siberia.
Yeah, well, it's more difficult to develop.
Or even in Yekaterinburg, it's cheaper.
No, I think it's impossible to do that as well anywhere else. Maybe Moscow is another alternative. If High School of Economics keeps rising prices in Russia, in St. Petersburg, we'll switch to Moscow.
No, I think
Almaty is good. Yeah, we can do that.
We're cheap.
And you don't need a visa to go there. Right? So, but we need a large city with history, with lots of backgrounds. We need also local experts in the city, things like that.
So Almaty?
Okay. Any other? Okay. Thank you for your presentation, for the discussion. I think, Andrei, you have some...
Right. Thank you very much. I think we actually will film in this. I think можно прекратить снимать уже. Otherwise, we will self-referential statement. So I think we'll do something with this footage. We'll just, if we find time to do that, we just cut most interesting.